Hey everybody, Drew Dinkmeyer here of Daily Roto, bringing you another edition of my cash game lineup review, this time for week 2 of the 2018 NFL season. Not a profitable week for me, so we'll go into the usual analysis, thinking about the process behind the cash game lineups, and then kind of talk through a little bit of the ideas of looking back where things might have gone wrong for me, where things might have gone right. As always, the building block for my cash game process each and every week is our projections over at Daily Roto that myself and Mike Leone work very hard during the course of the week to try to get as accurate as possible. I've sorted by value here on Fanduel, which we'll start off looking at Fanduel. I actually ended up creating 3 Fanduel cash game lineups this week, and they're all small iterations of the two, but ultimately one of the big challenges for me this week was trying to reconcile this really hefty projection we had on Michael Thomas versus being able to build lineups that were a little bit more balanced on the whole. And you'll see this conundrum that comes up both through my DraftKings and my FanDuel cash game lineup. So let's start with the first lineup of the 3. This one was enough to get across the cash line here, but just barely. I mean, this is not a particularly great lineup by and large. And this was actually a pivot lineup that was the third one that I created at the last minute. You'll see in all of my FanDuel cash game lineups this week, James Conner, Tevin Coleman, Antonio Brown, George Kittle, and the Washington defense. Those were the staples of my play this weekend. I think looking back, there were some iterations that if I go a little bit more balanced and get off Michael Thomas, that maybe I could pay up for a little bit more of a stable defense. The Rams and the Chargers were the defenses that were most intriguing this week to me, but Washington was the one that stood out as the best potential value on the slate for me. The Bucs ended up kind of creeping up at the end in our projections versus Philadelphia, but I wasn't quite comfortable there. So I ended up looking at Washington, New Orleans. I just wasn't going to do in cash after the week that they had last week, and then Los Angeles. The Rams and the Chargers were both there as well, and this 3,700 price tag just really kind of fit a lot of my builds. But you can see not a lot of separation there at the defensive positions at tight end. In terms of the values where we had George Kittle and Zach Ertz, and kind of looking back, I really did like George Kittle quite a bit, but the price gap between the two on FanDuel might have been enough that I should have considered some builds through Ertz. I didn't, and he's just a much more stable asset than George Kittle. Like, we have a long history of Zach Ertz being a very productive player at the NFL level and scoring touchdowns and being a focal point of the Philadelphia offense. So that's one in retrospect that I kind of feel like, $900, maybe I should have considered that difference a little bit more. At the wide receiver position, Antonio Brown and Michael Thomas were just blowing away the field in value, and Julio Jones was, in a similar price tag right there as well. Then you had Jarvis Landry, Keenan Allen, Kenny Golladay, Pierre Garçon, Aguilar, Thielen, and Dante Pettis at 4,500 and Kinsey and Nunwa at 5,000. I think were two of the cheaper plays that were interesting this week. And Nunwa, it was hard to figure out where we should go on the projection side in terms of how much market share we should give him after such a dominating performance. And then Pettis, it was hard to figure out, with Marquise Goodwin's injury. We're kind of giving best guess estimates as to what his playing time would be as well. Ultimately, Nunwa ended up being the better selection there, and I didn't have Nunwa in cash games, which did hurt a little bit because he was pretty owned by the field. But if I had built more balanced lineups and got it away from Michael Thomas, maybe that would have featured more Kenny Golladay, more Nelson Aguilar. Pierre Garçon was a disappointment as well as Dante Pettis. Those guys would have been interesting options to consider as well, certainly. At the running back position, though, it was pretty clear for me. Alvin Kamara, Todd Gurley, this was a 1v1 for me that I ended up splitting, and it depended on how much salary I had left. Then James Conner was a clear play to me, and Tevin Coleman was a clear play to me. At 5,900, I just felt like that opened up the slate so much. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey and Melvin Gordon were really good plays, and in retrospect, they had such big games that maybe I should have considered them more in balanced builds that got me off of Gurley or Kamara, and maybe allowed me a little bit more room to build as well. But those were generally the guys I was considering in cash games. And at the quarterback position, we had Roethlisberger, Breeze as a good value, but a really tough price tag. Then Alex Smith, who I've struggled with all week with our projections, just because I was concerned that there wouldn't be enough passing touchdown volume So I ended up going a little bit cheaper with Tyrod Taylor, or a little bit more expensive up to Ben Roethlisberger. Smith ended up kind of in a no man's land for me. And the last second pivot that got me that Case Keenum lineup was when I saw Denver's implied total keep rising throughout the week. And I kind of convinced myself, you know what, I'm not sure I want most of my cash game exposure on Tyrod Taylor, who has a below 20 team total on the road in New Orleans, even though he has the ability to make up for a lot of deficiencies with his rushing performance. I'd rather take the guy with the higher implied total. Both offenses ended up struggling. They ended up scoring similar points, but Keenum barely got him. Ironically, because of a Keenum rushing touchdown, not the way you drew it up, but Keenum barely outscored Tyrod Taylor 15.48 to 15.44. But those two lineups were exactly the same, with the exception of Alvin Kamara versus Todd Gurley. And the difference was simply in the Keenum lineup, I didn't have enough to get up to Kamara, so I chose Gurley there, and that was a natural split for me. But that was just a 2v2, exact same lineup, and a 16-point difference. One cashed, the other didn't. In terms of the lineup build, this is what I was kind of talking about. When you paid down at quarterback with Keenum or Tyrod Taylor, you were able to play the running backs that you wanted, James Conner, Tevin Coleman, and Todd Gurley, but I was also able to get Michael Thomas, and I really, really wanted Michael Thomas this week. That part of the play ended up working out perfectly, but the concessions that I made on my lineup by taking Michael Thomas, the difference in Keenum's production versus Ben Roethlisberger, who was the spend at quarterback, was huge, as were the differences between George Kittle and Zach Ertz production, or the Dante Pettis 4 versus the Quincy Enunwa, who got like 10 to 12, or Kenny Galladay. So you'll see in my Roethlisberger lineups, I wasn't able to get to Michael Thomas, but I was able to build through some of the mid-tier values that stuck out, like Kenny Galladay and Jarvis Landry. Now, this was another situation where I had the coin flip of Todd Gurley versus Alvin Kamara. I ended up at the end of the day, Kamara was ahead in our projections, but I got a little bit nervous on Kamara touchdown equity, and I knew I was going to have more of Kamara on DraftKings than I was on Fanduel. So I ended up choosing Gurley here. It was really the differentiator between this lineup cashing and not. At the end of the day, I feel pretty good about the decisions I made here. Looking back, maybe Jarvis Landry, even though he rated as a really good value, the touchdown equity might not have been as strong. And I did use him on DraftKings in some cash game lineups, so I might not need him necessarily here on Fanduel as well. The George Kittle exposure I'm fine with, but since I was going to play him so much on DraftKings, I do feel like I should have gotten some Zach Ertz. It was just such a good price tag on Zach Ertz. And looking back, I feel like, that's something that I could have done instead of having 100% of my cash game exposure out on George Kittle on the slate. And then ultimately, my cheap defenses just didn't come through for me this week. The Washington at home kind of laid a dud offensively, and that allowed Indy to run the ball a little bit more and not be in pressured situations. So they did have some turnovers from Andrew Luck, but didn't really rack up points by any means. In some of the high-scoring defenses, the Rams had a shutout. The Chargers, even though Buffalo scored points on them, they got the sacks and turnovers you would expect against Josh Allen. So I was giving up more than I expected at the defensive position. And then on these other two lineups at the quarterback position, I mean, the difference between Roethlisberger outscoring Tyrod Taylor or Case Keenum by 20-plus points is just very unusual. Usually, the quarterback gaps in production are somewhere around like 10 points. And that's where the Michael Thomas gap in potential wide receiver production I thought was so valuable. But ended up not working out. I think these Tyrod Taylor lineups were pretty close to our optimal on the slate. I think this one was our optimal on the slate. So, bottom third percentile in overall cash games, just not going to get it done this week. Disappointing, but you can see how just a few pivots away. And if you look at kind of the overall values on the slate, I think, we had a little bit of a challenge where some of the best values up top just didn't deliver, and all the mid-tier ones did really, really well, and that kind of separated things. And it was a week to spend at quarterback. So ended up cashing 2 of the 3 cash game lineups on FanDuel here. Didn't have a very good week in GPP, so lost money on FanDuel on the whole. But that was the cash game lineup approach there. On DraftKings, we'll look at the $25 double up, where I had 2 different cash game lineups on DraftKings, and they perform very differently. Once again, on DraftKings, you'll see similar core players: Tevin Coleman, James Conner, Antonio Brown, Kenny Galladay, George Kittle, Texans defense. Those players are all the same. So basically, this is just a 3v3 between the two lineups. This one, I wanted to try to force in Michael Thomas, and I did so with Deshaun Watson, who was a little bit more expensive than Jimmy Garoppolo, but my other lineup was going to have Jimmy Garoppolo. So this was a way for me to be able to diversify some of my quarterback exposure. And the thing that felt a little bit thin about this lineup was David Njoku, having that 2 tight end exposure. There weren't a lot of cheap running backs on the slate that were really cash game viable. I think James White was maybe the cheapest, but when Burkhead was ruled in and Sony Michel was ruled in, it got a little dicey there. And so tight ends really started popping into our optimals, and the tight ends always have low floors. There's so much that they have responsibilities for in the blocking game, and then they also need the pass volume. And so it's just tricky. That game played really slow. It kind of took away a lot of the value for me on the slate as a whole as I was heavy that game because Cleveland was able to play from ahead and just run the ball. Looking back, and this lineup actually cashed. This lineup was fine at 146.5. Looking back, I feel like one of the things I could have done with my DraftKings lineups on this slate were maybe emphasize the mid-tier cheap wide receivers a little bit more. And it would have allowed me to build maybe a little bit more balanced lineups, would have allowed me to use in the flex spot, maybe a Christian McCaffrey or a Melvin Gordon, something like that. And if you look at our projections, if we flip them over to DraftKings, you can see that I think most of the players that were defined as good values on the whole did quite well, but the specific lineup construction that you ended up on could have been very different. So, Michael Thomas was our top value at the end of the day of the week, ahead of Antonio Brown, simply because he was a little bit cheaper. Brown slightly out-projecting him there. Brown was going to be so chalky in cash games that it's a tough fade when he's going up against one of the weakest defenses in the league. But then Ben Roethlisberger, Alvin Kamara, James Conner, again, Alex Smith, who I was a little bit nervous on, Jimmy Garoppolo, Matt Ryan, Patrick Mahomes. A lot of the quarterbacks were good values here. If you go to by position, you'll see at the running back position that Alvin Kamara, James Conner, Christian McCaffrey, Todd Gurley, Melvin Gordon, Tevin Coleman, TJ Yeldon, Deion Lewis, and then things start to fall off. Kamara and Gurley were just tough to get up to. They were more expensive than Antonio Brown and Michael Thomas. They had similar projections, if not slightly worse in the case of Gurley. So I could automatically throw them out of my running back pool. I knew I was going to play James Conner. I knew I was going to play Tevin Coleman because Coleman was cheap. That third running back in a flex spot is where I got a little bit stumped, whether I was going to go with a third running back or whether I was going to go with the tight end. And the third running backs those lineups feel so much safer because you do get the running back production. I think the mistake that I made in my second lineup, which you'll see, is I did go with that third running back, but instead of coming all the way down to the mid-tier wide receiver values, I ended up landing on TJ Yeldon, who simply we didn't know. We knew Leonard Fournette was probably unlikely to play. We didn't know what the split was going to be between TJ Yeldon and Corey Grant. And TJ Yeldon played very efficiently, but they didn't run the ball a ton. They went very pass happy. And kind of looking back, I think that's one of the regrets I had on the week was not maybe adjusting Jacksonville's approach a little bit more, knowing that they'd probably be more pass happy without Leonard Fournette. And that might have saved me from TJ Yeldon, which ultimately hurt the other lineup. But we'll go to that other lineup, and you can see the difference. Remember, it's just a 3v3. It's instead of Deshaun Watson and Michael Thomas here and David Njoku, it's Jimmy Garoppolo, Jarvis Landry, and TJ Yeldon. And all three of these guys just had really middling performances. Garoppolo was especially disappointing given Patrick Mahomes went nuts at just $100 more. Deshaun Watson had that big day at like $300 more, $400 more. And Ben Roethlisberger went absolutely batty with all the passing touchdowns and even a rushing touchdown for $900 more. And those guys were all good values. I just kind of landed on the wrong one with Garoppolo here. You can see the same thing with Breeze. If you had landed on him, that would kind of be landing on the wrong one, or Alex Smith. But Garoppolo, Roethlisberger, Ryan, Mahomes, all very, very strong. So in this lineup, this is where I was saying I got a little bit hung up on what I should do with this running back spot. And ultimately, I think what I would like to do if I could go back on this is get off Jarvis Landry, who, yes, I felt pretty good about the volume, but, ultimately Cleveland, if they could keep that game tight, would want to play more defensive-oriented and more run-the-ball-oriented. And then get off of TJ Yeldon, who I was projecting for good workloads, but didn't have the same kind of safety as Melvin Gordon or Christian McCaffrey. And those guys just weren't that far away in price tag. So at the end of the day, that was really my biggest regret, was if I was going to force the third running back into that spot, it really should have been somebody that I had more confidence in their price tag, in their workload relative to their price tag. I think, we had, if you click on the output, you can see the actual results of the projections, but we had TJ Yeldon for like 16 carries and 4 catches, and that's kind of like a Leonard Fournette-esque workload with a little tilt to the passing game. And ultimately, with the coach speak of Corey Grant being more involved this week, maybe we should have considered that stronger, but he just didn't get near this workload. And that really was the differentiator. Whereas Christian McCaffrey, we're projecting 13 rushes, 6 catches, and the catches were so safe that I think I should have emphasized that workload, or Melvin Gordon, who was in this great matchup with Buffalo. Ultimately, those would have led to lineups that were probably better odds to cash than the one I ended up running out there. And that's just kind of looking back, a little bit of regret in terms of settling for a third running back that the workload was a little bit less determined, simply because they had another back behind him that had been successful against New England in a previous playoff game and whatnot. If you look at the mid-tier values, one guy that we were low on, Quincy Enunwa, and I do regret this one a little bit. Partially, I think the game flow kind of helped him getting from behind early, but he had such a big target share in week 1, and coming off of an injured and lost season, we didn't really know where to put it in week 2. So we got a little bit gun shy of going all the way up, but he at 4,700 was a good play. You also had Randall Cobb, Mohamed Sanu, who was a total dud for us, but was just projecting decently because we expected Atlanta to tilt towards the passing game a little bit more without Devontae Freeman. Kenny Golladay was the guy that I wanted to have in my lineups all week long. I thought he was the best value of this group. He ended up paying it off. Missed a wide open touchdown late in the game. Stafford just overthrew him. That really would have saved both of my lineups. Demaryius Thomas had a dud. Pierre Garçon had a dud. So the mid-tier was a little bit more volatile in terms of the results here. Like Golladay was great. Enunwa was really solid. The rest of the mid-tier was often a lot of disappointments. But I think I would have built in a little bit more floor into my lineups just by knowing that the running back touches for Melvin Gordon or Christian McCaffrey are so much more stable. So that was like my only regret kind of at the end of the week. This lineup finished, way out of the money. Pretty poor lineup as a whole at 119. This lineup finished just inside, like top 35%, top 40%. And ultimately, this was closer to our optimal. Our optimal was more along the lines of jamming in Michael Thomas at all costs. Looking back, I feel like this was a little bit of a week that, hedging the lineups actually saved me a little bit, because if I'm honest with myself, I think if I was to play just one lineup, I probably would have. I was so nervous about this 2 tight end lineup that I probably would have ended up with one of these, one tight end, running back, and flex lineups, and I probably would have lost the whole week on DraftKings. And then similarly on FanDuel, if I was just going to play one lineup, I was leaning more towards this Tyrod lineup, and then maybe splitting Kamara and Gurley. And ultimately, that split would have helped me salvage, but introducing this Ben lineup, which I felt so good about Ben, but at the end of the day, when I was like, I'm not playing him on DK, I need to get Ben in on FanDuel, and that saved a little bit of the cash game exposure this week. But that's how I go through my lineup process each week. I really leverage the projections at Daily Roto. Sometimes the top is flooded with values that hit. Sometimes there's landmines in there, and I fell on a few more of the landmines this week in particular. But I think the overall approach to kind of doing some of these 2v2s and 3v3s does, for me, help smooth out some of my performance in cash games over the course of the year. I know some people have asked me questions about the EV of it, and I think if you're making wildly different lineups, then yeah, you're probably sacrificing a little bit of EV over the course of the long term. But for me, these 2v2, 3v3 decisions with all overall strong values, I'm pretty comfortable making. In week 1, if I had played just one lineup, I probably would have done better on both sides. In week 2, had I played just one lineup, I would have done a lot worse. But this smooths out the results a little bit for me. So that'll do it for week 2's lineup review for my cash game lineups. Not a profitable week for me, but there were definitely paths to it being a really profitable week for me, which I'm comfortable with. I know DFS is not going to be a print fest every week. Hope those of you who are using our projections over at Daily Roto find this very useful. If you're not using our projections over at Daily Roto, please feel free to check us out over at dailyroto.com. You can join us for the season by clicking on that Go Premium tag and hanging out with us in subscriber chat and leveraging our projections and our optimizer for the rest of the NFL season. So that's it for me. Best of luck in all your games in week 3.